The planet they called New Eden was beautiful beyond words, and Commander Elena Varga stood on her balcony watching the twin suns set behind purple mountains that seemed to touch the sky itself. She had retired from Earth Fleet 15 years ago after spending 3 decades fighting in wars she barely remembered anymore. And now, she served as governor of this peaceful colony at the edge of known space. 12,000 humans called New Eden their home, and among them lived 2,000 children who attended the New Eden Preparatory Academy that sat on a green hill overlooking the main settlement. Elena smiled as she watched the children playing in the fields below, their laughter carrying on the warm evening breeze like music that reminded her why humanity reached for the stars in the first place. The colony had existed for 20 years without any major problems, and their relations with the neighboring alien species remained peaceful if somewhat cold. The Vthcari Dominion controlled the star systems beyond New Eden, and these insectoid creatures had never shown much interest in humanity beyond occasional trade negotiations. Elena had met their ambassadors several times and found them strange beings with compound eyes that showed no emotion and voices that clicked and buzzed in patterns her translator struggled to interpret. They were logical creatures who viewed the universe as a puzzle to be solved rather than a wonder to be experienced, and they had little patience for what they called the emotional weaknesses of mammalian species. But they had never been hostile, and Elena saw no reason to fear them as she watched the last light of the suns fade from the sky. She turned to go inside when her communication device buzzed with an urgent message from the Colony Defense Center. "Governor Varga, we have unknown vessels entering atmosphere." The young officer's voice trembled with confusion and fear. "They came out of nowhere, and they are not responding to our hails." Elena felt her old soldier instincts awaken as she rushed to her command console and pulled up the sensor data that made her blood run cold. 15 Vthcari warships descended through the clouds in perfect formation, and they were heading directly toward the academy. "Sound the alarm," Elena commanded as she grabbed her sidearm and ran for the door. "Get all security forces to the school right now." But she knew even as she ran that they would never make it in time, and the screaming had already begun by the time she reached the streets. The Vthcari ships hovered over the academy like metal insects, and armored soldiers poured from their holds with weapons that fired beams of burning light. Elena watched in horror as alien soldiers crashed through windows and doors, and the sounds of children screaming tore through the night air like knives through her heart. Parents ran toward the school with whatever weapons they could find, but the Vthcari cut them down without mercy or hesitation. A young mother fell beside Elena with a smoking hole in her chest, and her last words were a desperate cry for her daughter trapped inside those walls. Elena raised her pistol and fired at the nearest Vthcari soldier, but her shots bounced harmlessly off its armored shell as it turned those cold, compound eyes toward her. She expected to die in that moment, but the creature simply knocked her aside with one powerful limb and continued its mission. The attack lasted only 7 minutes, but those minutes stretched into an eternity of screams and fire and loss that Elena knew would haunt her until she died. When the Vthcari ships finally rose back into the sky and vanished into the darkness, they took 847 children with them. 63 more lay dead in the ruins of the academy, and Elena knelt among the broken bodies, with tears streaming down her face. Parents wailed in anguish as they searched through rubble for children who would never come home, and the colony that had known only peace now drowned in grief and rage. A young communications officer approached Elena with a recording device in his shaking hands. "Governor, Earth is asking for a report," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "The whole galaxy saw the attack through our broadcast satellites." Elena looked up at the night sky where those ships had disappeared, and something ancient and terrible awakened in her chest. She was 63 years old, and she had spent 30 years fighting wars that had seemed so important at the time. But nothing in her entire life had prepared her for the sight of children being dragged screaming into alien vessels, while their parents died trying to save them. She stood slowly and wiped the blood and tears from her face as she took the recording device from the young officer. "This is Commander Alina Varga of New Eden Colony." She spoke in a voice that carried the weight of all humanity's fury. "The Vthcari Dominion has attacked without warning or provocation." She paused and looked at the burning ruins of the academy, where rescue workers searched desperately for survivors. "They did not target our military installations or our infrastructure," she continued. "They came only for our children." Her voice hardened into something cold and sharp as she delivered her final words. "They took our children, and God help them because we will not." The message reached Earth within hours, and within days it had spread to every human colony and every alien civilization in the known galaxy. Footage of the attack played on screens across countless worlds, and species that had never given much thought to humanity watched in fascination and horror. The children screaming as they were torn from their parents' arms, the bodies of the small ones who resisted and paid with their lives, the weeping families left behind in the ashes. No one knew yet what the Vthcari wanted with human children, and no one could imagine the horrors those young ones would face in alien laboratories. But everyone who watched that footage understood one simple truth that would reshape the galaxy forever. Humanity had been wounded in a way that went beyond politics or territory or resources, and wounded animals were the most dangerous creatures in the universe. On Earth, in the great halls of the United Terran Assembly, leaders watched the footage in silence as the weight of what had happened settled upon them. And in that silence, a decision was being made that would spell doom for an entire species that had dared to touch humanity's most precious treasure. The Vthcari believed they had found interesting test subjects for their experiments, but they had made a mistake that no amount of logic could have predicted. They had forgotten that humans were once animals who fought and died to protect their young, and that instinct still burned in every human heart like a fire that could never be extinguished. The children of New Eden cried out for rescue in the darkness between stars, and all of humanity heard their call. The United Terran Assembly had not seen a full gathering in over 50 years, but now every seat was filled with representatives from every human colony in the galaxy. President Sarah Morrison stood at the central podium and looked out at faces filled with grief and rage as the footage from New Eden played one final time on the massive screens behind her. "We have received communication from the Vthcari Dominion," she announced when the footage ended. "They claim the children were taken for scientific research purposes." The chamber erupted in angry shouts that took several minutes to quiet down. "They say human neural development is unique in the galaxy," President Morrison continued with ice in her voice. "They believe our children hold secrets that could enhance their own species." She paused and let those words sink into the hearts of every person watching. "They have offered to return any surviving subjects when their research is complete." The word subjects hung in the air like poison, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. Admiral Marcus Chen sat in the military section with his hands clasped tightly together, as memories of his own grandchildren flooded his mind. He was 72 years old and had retired 10 years ago after a career that earned him the nickname, the Black Hand, for his ruthless efficiency in battle. His granddaughter Maya was 8 years old and lived on New Eden with her parents, and he had not heard from her since the attack. "I call for a vote," President Morrison declared, "all in favor of total species response." Every hand in the chamber rose without hesitation, and for the first time in 200 years, humanity voted unanimously for the complete mobilization of its entire civilization. Admiral Chen received his orders within the hour. and he felt the old fire ignite in his chest as he reviewed the fleet assignments. 4,000 warships from every human colony would gather under his command, and factories across human space would shift to wartime production immediately. Retired soldiers received calls asking them to return to service, and recruitment centers reported lines stretching around buildings as civilians volunteered by the millions. Scientists abandoned their research projects to develop new weapons, and engineers worked without sleep to upgrade every ship that could fly. The response was not organized by any government order, but flowed naturally from every human heart like blood rushing to heal a wound. On distant colony worlds, grandmothers taught their grandchildren to shoot, while fathers kissed their families goodbye and boarded transport ships. Teachers closed their schools and joined medical units, and factory workers smiled grimly as they loaded ammunition onto cargo vessels. Every human understood without being told what was at stake and what must be done. Meanwhile, the Galactic Council gathered in their great chamber to discuss what they called the human situation. Representatives from 100 species filled the curved seats that rose toward a domed ceiling painted with stars, and the Vthcari ambassador stood at the center podium with calm confidence. The humans react with typical mammalian emotion. He clicked and buzzed through his translator. They will send perhaps a few hundred ships to rescue their offspring, and we will destroy them. He waved one segmented limb dismissively as he continued. The Vthcari Dominion commands 15,000 warships and has never lost a war in our entire history. Several council members nodded in agreement, for the Vthcari were indeed a formidable military power that few would dare to challenge. We suggest the council remain neutral in this conflict, the ambassador concluded. It will be brief and decisive. The chamber murmured with discussion until a very old and very strange figure rose to speak. The Anthean observer had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations for longer than most species had existed, and the council always listened when this ancient being chose to share its wisdom. You do not understand what you have awakened, the observer spoke in a voice like rustling leaves. The humans have a concept they call protective instinct. The Vthcari ambassador made a dismissive clicking sound, but the observer continued. We have seen this instinct only once before in all our long memory, and that species no longer exists. The chamber fell silent as the observer's ancient eyes swept across the gathered representatives. Neither did their enemies. The Antheans sat down without another word, and the council voted to remain neutral as the Vthcari had requested. They expected a brief war ending in human defeat, and perhaps some negotiated settlement that would return the surviving children. They could not have been more wrong. Admiral Chen assembled his fleet in the shadow of Jupiter, and he stood on the bridge of his flagship watching ships arrive from every corner of human space. Destroyers and cruisers and carriers and battleships gathered in numbers that no human had ever commanded, and still more ships arrived every hour. His officers reported that production facilities were working at 300% capacity, and that new ships would join the fleet continuously throughout the campaign. Admiral, his communications officer called out, "We have received the intelligence report on the children." Chen took the data pad and read the words that turned his grief into something far more dangerous. The Vthcari had begun their experiments immediately, and the procedures involved were not gentle. Children had been dissected while still alive to study their neural pathways, and many had already died in laboratories that knew nothing of mercy. Maya's name was not among the confirmed dead, but it was not among the confirmed living either. Admiral Chen set down the data pad and looked out at his gathering fleet with eyes that held no more room for mercy. "Send a message to all ships," he commanded in a voice as cold as the void between stars. "We are not going to war." His officers looked at him with confusion until he finished his thought. We are going to end a species. The fleet departed Jupiter 3 days later, and every human who watched them go understood that something had fundamentally changed. Humanity had always been seen as emotional and unpredictable by the logical species of the galaxy, and many had assumed this made humans weak. But emotion was not weakness when it became purpose, and purpose was not weakness when it became action. The Vthcari had looked at human children and seen only test subjects, only biological puzzles to be solved. They had failed to see what those children truly were. They were the reason humanity had crawled out of caves and reached for the stars. They were the hope that made every sacrifice worthwhile. They were sacred, and now an entire species would learn the terrible cost of forgetting that truth. Admiral Chen stood at the front of his bridge as his fleet entered Vthcari space, and he whispered words that only he could hear. "We are coming for you, Maya. We are coming for all of them. And God help anyone who stands in our way." The Vthcari border patrol detected the human fleet 3 days before it arrived, and they sent urgent warnings to their high command that were met with cold dismissal. 4,000 ships, the Supreme Coordinator calculated with perfect logic. We have 15,000, and our technology is superior in every measurable way. He ordered a defensive fleet of 5,000 vessels to intercept the humans and end this conflict quickly. The battle began in the empty space between 2 dead stars, and it did not go as the Vthcari expected. Human ships fought with a ferocity that defied all tactical calculations, and pilots flew their vessels into impossible maneuvers that should have torn them apart. A Vthcari commander watched in confusion as a human destroyer rammed directly into his flagship, rather than retreat when its weapons failed. "Why do they not surrender?" he demanded as his ship broke apart around him. "This is not logical behavior." He died without understanding that logic had nothing to do with it. The human fleet lost 800 ships in that first battle, but the Vthcari lost 3,000, and the survivors fled back to their home systems, with something their species had never known before: fear. Admiral Chen did not pursue the retreating fleet because he had no interest in military victory. He ordered his ships to bypass enemy installations and proceed directly to the nearest Vthcari hive world. "Admiral," his tactical officer questioned with concern, "should we not secure our supply lines first?" Chen shook his head and explained the strategy that would become known as Protocol Prometheus. "We are not here to conquer territory or capture resources," he stated. "We are here to make certain they can never do this to anyone again." His fleet arrived at the first hive world and began their terrible work. Human ships deployed weapons the galaxy had never seen, and these weapons did not simply kill. They sterilized. Biological agents rained down on breeding facilities and destroyed the ability of Vthcari queens to produce offspring. Radiation weapons targeted agricultural centers and made the soil barren for 1,000 years. The hive world was not invaded or occupied, but simply removed from the future. The Vthcari watched in horror as their children's children became an impossibility, and their logical minds struggled to comprehend what was happening. This was not war as they understood it. This was extinction. Meanwhile, Commander Yuki Tanaka led a very different mission deep behind enemy lines. Her team called themselves the Guardian Angels, and every member had volunteered for one simple reason. They had all lost children in the attack on New Eden. Tanaka herself had watched her twin sons dragged onto a Vthcari ship, and she had spent every moment since preparing to get them back. Her team moved like ghosts through enemy space, and their intelligence came from human agents who had been studying the Vthcari for months. The research facilities are scattered across 12 different systems. Tanaka briefed her soldiers. "We hit them one at a time and we leave nothing alive." The first facility held 43 children in various stages of experimentation, and the guardian angels cut through its defenses like fire through paper. Tanaka found a young girl strapped to an examination table with tubes running into her skull, and she carried that child out of the facility with her own arms, while her soldiers burned everything behind them. The girl's name was Sophia, and she was 9 years old, and she told Tanaka what the Vthcari had done to her in a voice that no child should ever have to use. "They wanted to see how our brains worked," Sophia whispered. "They said it would hurt, but that our pain did not matter because we were just animals." Tanaka held Sophia close and made a promise that she would keep no matter what it cost. "No more children will suffer," she swore, "not ever again." The guardian angels hit 6 more facilities over the following weeks, and each rescue revealed new horrors that hardened human resolve across the galaxy. Children who had been partially dissected and kept alive for study. Children who had watched their friends die on operating tables beside them. Children who no longer remembered their own names because of what had been done to their minds. The Vthcari High Command finally understood that they had made a catastrophic error, and they attempted to negotiate. Their message reached Admiral Chen as his fleet approached their third hive world, and he read their offer with cold eyes. "They will return all surviving children immediately in exchange for a ceasefire," his communications officer reported. The Admiral was silent for a long moment before he responded. "Ask them why they did not make this offer before they started cutting our children open." The Vthcari ambassador tried to explain that the experiments had been conducted in the interest of scientific progress, and that surely humans could understand the value of knowledge. Admiral Chen's response became legend across the galaxy. "You had the chance to return them unharmed," he transmitted. "You chose to dissect them instead." He paused and looked at the hive world filling his view screen. "There is nothing left to discuss." The third hive world fell silent, and then the fourth, and then the fifth. Human volunteers continued to flood recruitment centers faster than anyone could process them, and the fleet grew larger even as it suffered losses. A grandmother from Earth's moon colony flew a cargo ship loaded with explosives into a Vthcari supply depot. A father who had lost 3 children in the attack piloted a fighter until his ship was torn apart, and then ejected into space to fire his sidearm at enemy vessels until he died. A teenage girl who had escaped the academy hacked into Vthcari communications and provided intelligence that saved thousands of human lives. Every human had become a soldier, and every soldier had become a weapon forged in grief and love. Commander Tanaka's team reached the 8th research facility and found something that made even these hardened warriors weep. A room filled with small bodies that had not survived the experiments, arranged in neat rows like specimens in a museum. And among them, 2 boys who looked exactly alike, their dead eyes staring at nothing. Tanaka fell to her knees beside her sons and held their cold hands for the last time. Her second-in-command approached carefully and asked what they should do now. Tanaka stood slowly and wiped her tears away with hands that would never stop shaking. "We save the ones who are still alive," she answered, "and we make sure this never happens to any child ever again." She walked out of that room and never looked back. But something had changed in her eyes, and the Vthcari who stood between her and the remaining children learned what it meant to face a mother with nothing left to lose. The 9th facility fell, and then the 10th and the 11th. And somewhere in the chaos of a dying civilization, a little girl named Maya Chen waited in a cell and prayed that someone would come for her. She did not know that her grandfather commanded the fleet that was burning worlds to reach her. She only knew that she was scared and alone, and that the bad bugs were coming for her again. But she also knew, with the simple faith of a child, that someone would save her. Because that is what humans did. They saved their children, no matter what it cost. The Galactic Council chamber had never been so full, and representatives from every known species crowded into seats meant for half their number. They had come to watch the impossible unfold on screens that showed the systematic destruction of the Vthcari dominion. 12 hive worlds have gone silent, the council moderator announced in a voice that trembled. The human fleet has suffered significant losses but continues to advance. The Vthcari ambassador stood at his podium, with his compound eyes flickering in patterns that his species only showed when experiencing true terror. "This is madness," he clicked desperately. "They are destroying themselves along with us, and for what?" "For their children," the Anthean observer answered from its ancient seat. "Did we not warn you?" The ambassador turned to face the council with something that might have been pleading. "We request immediate military intervention from any species willing to assist us," he begged. "The humans must be stopped before they destabilize the entire region." The Vthcari Federation ambassador rose to speak, and his feline features showed the careful neutrality his species was known for. "The Vthcari Federation offers to mediate this conflict," he announced. "We propose a diplomatic summit to discuss terms." Admiral Chen allowed the Vthcari diplomatic vessel to approach his flagship, and the ambassador expected to negotiate with a reasonable military commander. Instead, Chen showed him the evidence. Medical reports from rescued children detailing experiments that made the ambassador's fur stand on end. Recordings from Vthcari laboratories, where scientists discussed their subjects like they were discussing equipment. Testimony from survivors who described watching their friends cut apart while they waited for their turn. The Vthcari ambassador wept openly as he reviewed the documents, for his species also treasured their young above all else. "I cannot mediate this," he admitted with shame. "I would not want to mediate this." He returned to his ship and departed without another word, and his report to the Vthcari Council recommended complete neutrality with a personal note that read simply, "They deserved this." Other species attempted their own interventions with similar results. The Then Collective offered asylum to Vthcari refugees, and the humans allowed them to proceed without interference. "We have no quarrel with those who give shelter to the helpless," Admiral Chen explained, "only with those who harm children." But he also made clear that any species accepting Vthcari military vessels or leadership would be considered hostile, and the Then quietly revised their asylum policy. The Keth hegemony was not so diplomatic. They had been rivals of humanity for generations, and they saw an opportunity to strike while the human fleet was committed elsewhere. Their ambassador stood before the Galactic Council and declared that the Keth would intervene to restore order in Vthcari space. "The humans have gone too far," he growled through sharp teeth. "They must be shown that such behavior will not be tolerated." The Keth mobilized 3,000 warships and moved toward the conflict zone with confidence that their superior numbers would intimidate the weakened human forces. Earth's response came not from Admiral Chen, but from the United Terran Assembly itself. President Morrison appeared on every screen in the galaxy and spoke with a calm that was far more frightening than any threat. "To the Keth hegemony and any other species considering intervention," she began, "we offer this simple message." She paused and looked directly into the camera with eyes that held no compromise. "Any species that stands between humanity and its children will share the Vthcari fate." Another pause, and then words that would echo through history. "This is not a threat, it is a promise." The Keth fleet held position for 6 hours, while their commanders debated what to do. Intelligence reports showed that human production facilities were operating at unprecedented capacity, and that new ships joined the war effort every day. More concerning were reports from Keth spies within human space, describing the mood of the population. A Keth agent had observed a human daycare center, where children barely old enough to walk practiced evacuation drills, with tiny backpacks filled with emergency supplies. "They are preparing their entire species for total war," the agent reported. "Not just soldiers, but everyone, including those who have never seen combat." The Keth commanders looked at these reports and made a calculation that had nothing to do with military strength. They asked themselves what would happen if they intervened and won. Would the humans surrender? Or would every human colony become a fortress, every human citizen become a soldier, every human child grow up with one purpose? The Keth fleet withdrew without firing a single shot, and their ambassador quietly resigned from his position the following day. The Vthcari, now truly desperate, attempted one final gambit. Their remaining fleet of nearly 6,000 ships abandoned the defense of their worlds and made a direct strike at Earth itself. "If we cannot survive," the Supreme Coordinator declared, "then neither will they." The Battle of Saul became the largest naval engagement in human history. Earth's home fleet was outnumbered 2-1, but they were not alone. 12,000 civilian vessels joined the defense, and these were not military ships but merchant freighters and mining barges and personal yachts, armed with whatever weapons their owners could find. Grandmothers flew ancient cargo haulers that should have been scrapped decades ago. Teachers piloted passenger shuttles loaded with improvised explosives. Shopkeepers aimed mining lasers that had never been designed for combat. They were not soldiers, and they knew they would probably die. But the Vthcari had touched human children, and that meant every human who could reach the battle would fight. The battle lasted 9 hours, and the casualties were horrific on both sides. But when the last Vthcari ship finally exploded, not one enemy vessel had reached Earth. A captured Vthcari commander was brought before a human tribunal, and he asked a question that had haunted his species since this nightmare began. "Why do you fight like this?" he demanded. "You lose ships and soldiers and civilians by the thousands, and yet you never stop." The human guard who stood beside him answered without hesitation. "You touched our children." The Vthcari tilted his head in confusion. "That is not a logical reason to destroy yourselves along with us." The guard smiled in a way that made the alien's compound eyes flicker with fear. "There is no version of this universe where you survive that," the guard explained. "No negotiation that could have saved you, no surrender that would have been accepted." He leaned closer to the prisoner. "You could have offered us every planet in your dominion and every ship in your fleet, and we would have burned it all just to reach the ones who hurt our children." The Vthcari was silent for a long moment. "Then we never had a chance," he finally realized. "No," the guard agreed, "you never did." The tribunal found him guilty and scheduled his execution for the following morning. Across the galaxy, species who had watched this war with academic interest now looked at humanity with new understanding. The humans were not the strongest species, or the most advanced, or the most numerous. But they had shown the galaxy something that transcended all of those measurements. They had shown what happens when you touch what humans hold sacred. And every species quietly updated their diplomatic protocols to include one simple rule: never harm human children. Never give humans a reason to decide your species should not exist. Because once that decision was made, nothing in the universe could change it. 1 year had passed since the attack on New Eden, and the Vthcari Dominion no longer existed. Commander Yuki Tanaka walked through the corridors of the final research facility with her weapon raised, and her heart pounding in her chest. This was the last known location where human children might still be held, and her guardian angels had fought through 3 defensive lines to reach it. "Contact ahead," one of her soldiers reported. "Looks like they are making a final stand." Tanaka nodded and signaled her team to advance, and they moved through the facility like water flowing through cracks in stone. The Vthcari scientists and guards who remained fought with the desperation of creatures who knew they had nowhere left to run. But desperation was no match for purpose, and the guardian angels had been forged in the same fire that had consumed an entire civilization. The last defender fell with a gurgling click, and Tanaka stepped over its body to reach the door it had been protecting. She opened it and found herself looking into the eyes of a small girl with dark hair, and a face that she recognized from countless briefings. Maya Chen sat in a cell no larger than a closet, and she looked up at Tanaka with eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. "Are you here to save me?" the girl asked in a voice that was barely a whisper. Tanaka knelt down and smiled through the tears that streamed down her face. "Yes," she answered, "your grandfather sent us." Maya's eyes widened with hope that had almost been extinguished. "Grandpa Marcus." "Admiral Marcus Chen," Tanaka confirmed. "He has been fighting to reach you since the day they took you." She reached out and lifted the girl gently into her arms, and Maya wrapped her thin arms around Tanaka's neck and held on like she would never let go. "The bad bugs," Maya whispered with fear, "are they gone?" Tanaka carried her out of that terrible place and into the light of a sun that the Vthcari would never see rise again. "Yes," she promised, "forever." The rescue of Maya Chen and the last 47 children marked the end of the war, though in truth the war had ended long before. The Vthcari had been broken not by a single defeat, but by systematic extinction that left nothing behind. Their 23 hive worlds had been rendered permanently sterile, and their population of 80 billion had been reduced to scattered refugees who would never breed again. Some species in the Galactic Council argued that this was genocide and demanded that humanity face consequences. But those arguments faded quickly when the evidence from the research facilities was presented. Recordings of children begging for mercy while scientists discussed their procedures. Bodies of young humans preserved in specimen jars like insects in a collection. Detailed notes describing experiments that no civilization should ever conduct on any sentient being. The Council voted unanimously to classify the Vthcari Dominion as a criminal entity and its destruction as justified self-defense. Of the 847 children taken from New Eden, 612 were recovered alive. 235 had died in laboratories and cells across Vthcari space, and their names were carved into a memorial that stood on the rebuilt grounds of the New Eden Preparatory Academy. Commander Elena Varga attended the dedication ceremony and spoke words that were broadcast across every human world. "These children did not die in vain," she declared. "They showed the galaxy what happens when you underestimate the bond between humanity and its young." She paused and looked at the assembled survivors who sat in the front rows. "And they showed us what we are capable of when that bond is threatened." Admiral Marcus Chen retired again after the war, and this time he meant it to be permanent. He spent his remaining years on New Eden with his granddaughter, and he never spoke publicly about what he had ordered during the campaign. Some called him a hero, and others called him a monster, and he accepted both titles without comment. He knew the truth that very few would ever understand. He had not enjoyed what he did, and he would carry the weight of it until he died. But he would do it again without hesitation if anyone threatened Maya. That was what the galaxy still struggled to comprehend. Humans were not proud of their capacity for destruction. They were simply incapable of restraining it when their children were at stake. Commander Tanaka returned to New Eden and opened an orphanage for children who had lost their families during the war. She named it for her twin sons and spent the rest of her life caring for the young ones who needed her. The 612 survivors grew up with scars that would never fully heal, but they grew up nonetheless. Some became soldiers who swore to protect other children from the fate they had suffered. Some became diplomats who worked to ensure such conflicts would never happen again. Some became scientists who searched for ways to heal the wounds that the Vthcari had inflicted. And one, a little girl named Maya Chen, grew up to become the greatest ambassador humanity had ever known. She stood before the Galactic Council 40 years after her rescue and spoke with a voice that carried the wisdom of someone who had seen both the worst and best of what sentient beings could do. "I was 6 years old when the Vthcari took me," she told the assembled representatives. "I remember the fear and the pain, and the darkness that seemed like it would never end." She paused and looked around the chamber at species who had once watched her people with fear and confusion. "But I also remember the moment Commander Tanaka lifted me into her arms and told me I was safe." Her voice softened with emotion that she had learned to control, but never to suppress. "That moment taught me what humanity truly is." She stepped forward and addressed the council directly. "We are not the strongest species in the galaxy, and we are not the wisest, and we are certainly not the most logical." A small smile crossed her face. "But we love our children with a fire that cannot be extinguished, and we will tear the stars from the sky to protect them." She raised her chin with pride that came from surviving the unsurvivable. "That is not a weakness to be exploited. It is a warning to be heeded." The Anthean observer nodded slowly and spoke for the first time in decades. "The human ambassador speaks the truth," the ancient being confirmed. "We have updated our records accordingly." The entry in the Galactic Encyclopedia now contained a single addendum that was taught to every spacefaring species before they ever encountered humanity. "Do not touch the human children, ever, for any reason they will end you." And in the dark spaces between stars, civilizations that had once dismissed humanity as emotional and primitive now watched them with something that went beyond fear. They watched with respect, because the humans had shown them that love was not a weakness to be exploited. Love was a weapon that could unmake worlds. And those who forgot that lesson would learn it the way the Vthcari had learned it. In fire and ash and silence that would last forever. On New Eden, the sun rose over green hills where children laughed and played without fear. Maya Chen's grandchildren ran through fields that had once been soaked with blood, and they knew nothing of the horrors their grandmother had survived. They only knew that they were safe and loved and protected. And that was enough. That was everything. That was why humanity reached for the stars in the first place. Not for power or knowledge or territory, but for the hope that somewhere out there, their children could grow and thrive and become something wonderful. And heaven help anyone who tried to take that hope away.